Hello and welcome to World Talks, where every word matters. I'm your host, Sasha Farbach. Now, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is due to meet President Donald Trump in the White House on Thursday. Starmer is the second European leader to meet the U.S. president since his inauguration in January, following French President Emmanuel Macron on Monday. Now, the British leader has insisted on security guarantees for Ukraine. But will he be able to sway Donald Trump? This meeting comes at a crucial time for transatlantic relations, not just for the UK, but for all of Europe. And now to discuss the topic further, I'm joined by Edward Lucas, Senior Advisor, Center for European Policy Analysis. Good to have you with us. Let's start off. These security guarantees, will this special relationship between the UK and the US, will Starmer convince Trump for more?
Well, Sasha, I think one has to be very cautious with the phrase special relationship. It has a real meaning in the narrow world of nuclear weapons because British nuclear weapons rely on very close cooperation with the United States, and it certainly means something in the intelligence world and to some extent also in the military world. But more widely, it's a bit of a comfort blanket, I think, for Britain, and it doesn't mean that America does anything it doesn't want to do. So I'm worried, really, that Starmer's going to ask President Trump for security guarantees, and the answer is going to be no. You Europeans need to worry about this. You go fix it. And that leaves us in a very difficult position.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Starmer has said also something, I want to get onto the defense spending in a moment, but first on this backstop. He said that without this backstop by the United States, that this peace will not last, that Russia will come back. I mean, at this point, it's mercurial dealings with Trump every day, but nevertheless, I'll push you on this. Will it be, let's say, something unique? Will Starmer have what it takes maybe to get a little bit more out of Donald Trump this time around?
Well, I don't think Starmer can make President Trump do anything he doesn't want to do. Britain, in the end, if you have a confrontation with Trump as Britain, Trump holds the cards. Ultimately, he can say, I'm not going to service your nuclear weapons anymore. And that's the end of your status as supposedly a sort of nuclear power. And we've been joined at the hip for so long with the Americans that we sometimes think we're equal partners, but we're really not. They're much bigger, richer, stronger, more important than we are. So Starmer's job is to try and maybe flatter or charm Trump into doing the right thing on Ukraine, but he can't really make him. And the problem is that the Europeans on their own just don't have the military muscle to secure Ukraine after any ceasefire that Trump and Putin have negotiated.
Mm-hmm. Interesting word that you said he has to potentially charm Donald Trump. I mean, he seems to be charmed by certain deals, transactions. Is it any coincidence that the eve before Starmer went off to the United States, and we hear more about this defense review, more money for the British defense sector, looking at defense spending, I think, from 2.3% to 2.5% by 2027, up to 2.6%. But is that going to cut it? Is this going to be the music for Donald Trump that he wants to hear?
Not really. I mean, I'm afraid President Trump doesn't really do decimal points. He likes nice big numbers with a billion at the end. And I think if I was trying to get his interest, I'd say we are creating a $1 trillion critical minerals and rare earths project, which is going to be called the Donald J. Trump Save the West Minerals Project or something like that. He likes big, flashy numbers, and he's always very keen that there should be a sort of theatrical denouement of every plot twist that he writes. And this sort of cautious, nerdy world of international relations is not really suited for dealing with someone like the mercurial American president. I'm delighted that we're spending more on defence. I hope we spend it wisely. If we'd spent the money better in the past, we wouldn't be needing to spend so much more now. And I'm afraid that the small increase that's been announced is nowhere near enough for the wholesale recapitalisation of our defence, which we need after decades of hollowing out and neglect.
Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, I think if we look at NATO heavyweights, the UK is still among them. I think also operationally one of those countries that really can step up on a level with the Navy, with the Air Force, with boots on the ground.
Well, I'm glad you think so. That's not the impression that I get. And we struggle to deploy 1,000 troops in the tripwire force we have in Estonia. and we upped it to 2,000 and then had to take it down to 1,000. A single brigade of the British Army 30 years ago had more combat power than the entire British Army does now. We have, I think, 14 artillery pieces, one seaworthy frigate. We're terribly short of planes. Our ammunition stocks are woefully low. And there are some things that we are extremely good at. We have extremely capable special forces. We still have the nuclear deterrent. There's some very good advanced sort of high-tech stuff. But as a full spectrum military power, as the Americans have said very bluntly, we no longer compete. We promised NATO that we could field a warfighting division. We can't. We can't even field a warfighting brigade at the moment. And so that's a really serious problem.
Mm-hmm. So looking at things that still need to change and change quickly, but you mentioned also nuclear deterrence. This is an interesting question as well. Also in the last days, we've heard, the chancellor in waiting of Germany, Friedrich Merz, already on his trip to Paris just a day ago, already talking a few days even before that. Nuclear sharing for Germany also, in case of America pulling out of all this potentially, that would be unprecedented. But then the UK with Trident, maybe also the French. Do you see a kind of umbrella possible here that it could include other nations?
Well, Sasha, I think the first point is that the nuclear pax Americana that we've had since the late 1940s is over. I don't think anybody seriously believes that Donald Trump would risk nuclear war to protect Europe. And so we are on our own. And the problem is we're not ready for that. Now, you mentioned the French deterrent, and certainly that is more flexible than the British one. It have smaller nuclear warheads and different ways of delivering them, including from planes. So it has a range of responses. The British nuclear deterrent has two problems. One is it's really very dependent on the Americans. It's delivered by American missiles, and if America chooses to stop servicing them, then our deterrent quite soon stops working. The other problem is that it's a doomsday weapon. It's the sort of last-ditch deterrent, and that doesn't really work in this world of brinkmanship and salami slicing, which is what the Russians are specialists at and pursuing extremely successfully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also, but I think if we're looking at Germany, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, on the protocol for the French, I think in terms of nuclear deterrence, it doesn't include allies. And then how would this work even? If we're looking at NATO structures, if we're looking at individual country structures, who has the final say? I think just building up such an umbrella seems like a nice idea, but how would it even potentially work in practice, and how would it be feasible?
Well, you're right. It's fraught with difficulties, and the French would be extremely reluctant, I think, to have anybody else's finger on their nuclear trigger. It's really there to defend France. And you might cast the sort of nuclear shadow a bit further east. And certainly in the past, for example, France has sent its nuclear-capable warplanes to take part in NATO exercises in Poland, which was sending a little signal to the Kremlin. We're serious. But I think that you're asking these sort of most profound and existential questions when you get into nuclear doctrine. Are you willing to risk a nuclear attack on your country in order to protect another one? Mm-hmm. And I think that will be a big stretch for both Britain and for France if we have to provide the nuclear umbrella for all of Europe. And I am deeply worried about how we protect credibly any sort of tripwire force we put in Ukraine. If we put some troops or warships around Odessa, the Russians attack them, are we going to strike back and hit Crimea? Are we going to hit Rostov? Are we going to hit the Russian heartland? Are we willing to risk a war with Russia, particularly if they're rattling their nuclear saber? This is a deep existential crisis of a kind that Europe hasn't experienced since the 1930s. And I think Poland is kind of ready for this because you live with it every day. I'm not sure that we are.
Mm-hmm. If we look at existential questions, this is also something President Zelensky has pointed out. He's adamant about these security guarantees. He's adamant about having Americans involved. He's due to meet Trump also in the next sort of 24 hours. The kind of groundwork that Starmer will do now, how will that impact this meeting potentially tomorrow with Zelensky?
It's going to be very difficult. You've got Trump's basically said publicly that he sympathizes with Putin. He has blamed Ukraine for starting the war. He doesn't really think that Ukraine exists as a country, I suspect. And certainly people close to him have said that Ukraine is a project, not a country. And they've said in private to me very disparaging things about the Ukrainians. They think that Ukraine is like kind of Mexico is the United States. It's a sort of inferior country which the big country has the right to push around. I think that's reprehensible, but those views are there. There's also the much bigger worry to me that there are sort of people in the Trump camp who have a neo-Kissingerian idea that they can hand Europe or Eastern Europe to Russia as a kind of bribe in order that the Russians will dump the Chinese and team up with the Americans against Beijing. I think that's a foolish idea and doomed to failure. But there are people in and around the Trump camp who think this is the thing to do. They don't take Europe seriously. They don't like Europe. They don't think Europe's an ally, and they don't see why America should pay any price for defending Europe when they could get something by abandoning it to the Russians.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one sort of thing that some people are still hoping for, that this may well be still a massive bluff by Trump, or is this now American policy now that we really have the Kremlin policy being adopted very much by Washington, or is Trump going to surprise us in the next days with something that's still more in line with protecting Ukraine? How do you assess this? I mean, policy changes over time rather slowly, but it seems it's just changed so fast that it has a lot of people worried.
I think you're absolutely right to highlight the fact that President Trump changes his mind quite frequently, and he lives for the day, for the moment. And he likes the idea of deals, and particularly deals that he can say he's the winner. And that's what we have to deal with. And in the short term, I think it's possible that we don't have a complete catastrophe. It may well be that the having, as he would see it, beaten Ukraine into agreeing with him by insults and other sorts of pressure, now he'll turn his attention to Putin and say, I want American access to these mineral-rich areas in the east. And perhaps we'll be pleasantly surprised by the shape of the ceasefire deal when it comes. And I think the real damage is much greater and deeper than that. This isn't really about how we get some kind of temporary end to the war in Ukraine. It's about whether the United States is still on our side here in Europe, and the signals that Trump is sending, and they're quite profound ones, are not. And it's only a couple of days ago, the United States voted with Russia and with North Korea and Iran and other similar states against its oldest and closest allies in Europe on a matter of war. That's a profound act of strategic choice and betrayal. And I don't think the transatlantic marriage can recover from that.
Well, it's also, I think, worrying people that part of that whole structure, also the European Union, is being ignored. I mean, we had Kaja Kallas, the head of the European Union's foreign diplomacy wing, being basically ignored by Marco Rubio. But nevertheless, I mean, we have these cards as they are right now. Do you see right now, potentially, if we're looking at also security guarantees on the European side, Zelensky has ruled that out, but I'm just curious on your mind. I mean, Starmer said UK troops could be part of any kind of peacekeeping force. The French have also asserted their willingness for this. Is this a way that Europe could rise to the challenge? Do you see this taking shape in the next next months or so?
Well, Sasha, I implore you not to call this peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is when you have a neutral, lightly armed force who are there, not party to the conflict, to keep the warring sides apart. That's what we have in Cyprus and Lebanon and places like that. What we're proposing to do is to put a deployment of troops in Ukraine, which will secure Ukraine so that Russia doesn't come back for second helpings. That's not peacekeeping. That's an intervention force, much more like what we put in Bosnia. Now, I don't think we can do that. We need 200,000 troops to be there, 200,000 troops training to go there, and 200,000 troops recovering from having been there. That would be if we were going to do it in a proper, solid way, in the way we protected West Germany during the Cold War when it was under threat from the Warsaw Pact. That physically can't happen. I don't think it could even happen, actually, if we had the full support of the United States. And without that, it's impossible. So we have to try and do it by some other means. And I think what they're cooking up is a mixture of air and missile defense and long-range precision strikes. If you had French Scalp missiles, maybe Polish JASSMs, British Storm Shadows, German Taurus, and some Tomahawk cruise missiles, and you said to the Russians, you cross this line into Ukraine again, and we're going to hit you with 100 long-range precision strikes, that in theory is a pretty powerful deterrent. The question is, would the Russians believe it? Are we really up for that? And that's a question you'd have to ask the Polish public. Would you be willing to hit heartland Russia with a Polish missile because the Russians had crossed a line somewhere in Ukraine.
Yeah, these are very, very big questions indeed that will no doubt be discussed also particularly between Mr. Starmer and Mr. Trump today in the White House and beyond that. We'll close it there. Thank you so much, Edward Lucas there from the Center for European Policy Analysis. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sasha.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay tuned. Much more coming up right here on TVP World. Goodbye.